And welcome once again to Flashpoints. I'm Bob Orr. Joining me as always is Juan Zarate, our national security analyst. Juan, good to see you.
Bob, good to be with you from afar.
We make a point that Juan is at Harvard doing some work up in Cambridge, Mass. Let's talk again about Ukraine and what the U.S. options are. I mean, clearly military force is not on the table here, but what menu of options are available or is available now to President Obama?
Well, when President Obama talked about cost to Russia if they crossed the line or at least interfered in the Ukraine, I think he plainly had in mind financial measures that could be implemented with Europe or even unilaterally. And I think there's a menu there that the president can choose from. I think in the first instance, Bob, you would see the U.S. government targeting Russian officials or individuals or even businesses that are tied to the activities in Crimea, the intervention in the Ukraine. That can be done with a new executive order or with new legislation. You also have Congress talking about the expansion of the Magnitsky List. This was the human rights list named after Sergei Magnitsky that named certain Russian officials tied to human rights violations. That seems to be on the table as an expanded list. But beyond that, there are ways of broadening existing sanctions that exist, for example, on Syria or Iran or organized crime, where you could target Russian businesses, banks, individuals that would then be blocked from doing business in the U.S., have their assets frozen, and even would be noticed by European banks even if Europe didn't go along with it. All of this, though, being dictated and constrained by the diplomacy and the appetite in part by Europe to take on costs of these kinds of measures.
It would be a big hammer, I think, to go after Russian banks. Could the U.S. do that unilaterally without European partnership? Because some of the European countries have already expressed some real concerns about that.
Right. Ideally, you'd want broad cooperation, and certainly from Western Europe and key banking centers like London or Frankfurt to go along with any measures. But certainly the U.S. has used unilateral measures, what I consider to be, frankly, inherently global measures, something I've written about in my book, as you know, Bob, to actually target and tar a Russian bank, for example, that may be assisting President Assad in Damascus with his human rights violations. And so that can be done. And the moment that the U.S. Treasury, either through its sanctions policy or regulations, designates a bank like that as a bad actor, it's not just important for the U.S. banking system, but the rest of the world will be on notice, and European banks, Asian banks will be on notice, regardless of what their governments say. And so inherently what the U.S. government says in the context of international banking will have multilateral effect. Now, that still doesn't mean that U.S. policymakers will want to go forward if Europe is not on board, but certainly we have within our means to go after Russian entities and to have a real bite on them economically.
Russian financial markets noticed right away. I mean, the first day after the Russian troops moved into Crimea, the markets there went down like 10%. Is this something that President Putin has a full grasp about?
Well, actually, I think he does, and I think the Russians have in mind the financial dimensions of warfare and influence, probably more so than we realize. Certainly the stock market plunge and the ruble fall plays into the calculus, but I think Putin's playing a bit of a longer game here. And you've already heard aides around Putin starting to warn Europe about taking aggressive measures. Of course, Russia has used gas and oil supplies in the past to try to influence events in the Ukraine and Europe. Russia has threatened potentially Western banking and commercial interests. And Russia does have the ability to bite back financially. And I think you've started to see signals from Moscow and the Kremlin that they may be willing to bite back pretty hard if financial measures and sanctions are undertaken. And so we may be seeing the start of a financial war that is parallel to the tensions we're seeing in the Ukraine. And frankly, the Russians know how to play this pretty well.
Obviously something we're going to have to keep an eye on in the days going forward. Juan, thanks as always.
Thank you, Bob.
And thanks to you for watching Flashpoints. I'm Bob Orr. We will see you again next time.